Imagine a quiet suburban night in the United States, where the comfort of home is suddenly shattered by a rhythmic knocking at the front door. You look through the peephole to see two young children standing on your porch, looking down at their feet. They seem lost and harmless, so your instinct is to open the door and offer assistance to the vulnerable pair. But a primal alarm bell rings in the deepest part of your reptilian brain, screaming that something is terribly wrong with this picture. You hesitate with your hand hovering over the deadbolt as an overwhelming sense of dread washes over you like a bucket of ice water. The children do not speak immediately, but the intense feeling of fear radiates through the heavy wood of the door. When they finally speak, their voices are monotonous and devoid of any childish inflection or emotion. They ask to come inside to use your telephone or to get a drink of water because they are lost. The requests seem reasonable on the surface, yet the terrifying aura they project makes your hands tremble uncontrollably. You find yourself fighting a mental battle between social conditioning to help children and a biological imperative to survive a predator. This is the hallmark of the black-eyed children phenomenon. These encounters have become a staple of modern urban legends and internet folklore, but many claim the fear is genuine. The stories always follow a rigorous pattern involving children between the ages of 6 and 16, appearing in places they should not be at odd hours. They often wear clothing that looks slightly outdated or ill-fitting, as if they are mimicking human dress rather than understanding it. But the most terrifying detail is always revealed last. When the witness finally gets a good look at their faces, they see eyes that are solid black from lid to lid, with no sclera or iris visible. The modern legend of the black-eyed children can be traced back to a specific event involving a journalist named Brian Bethel. It was the evening of January 16th in the year 1996 in the city of Abilene, Texas. Brian Bethel was sitting in his car parked outside a movie theater while using the light from the marquee to write a check for his internet service provider. The location was the Camelot Communications building, which was next to the movie theater, and the parking lot was mostly empty at this late hour. The setting was mundane and safe, which made the subsequent events even more jarring. As Brian Bethel focused on writing his check, he was suddenly interrupted by a knock on the driver's side window of his vehicle. He looked up to see two young boys standing directly outside his car door. He had not heard them approach, which was strange given the quiet nature of the parking lot and the gravel surface. The sudden appearance of the boys startled him, but he rolled down the window a few inches to see what they wanted. He initially assumed they were looking for money for a movie ticket or perhaps needed a ride home. The two boys appeared to be roughly 10 and 14 years old and wore hooded pullovers that were typical for the mid-90s. Brian Bethel noted that their skin was somewhat pale, but otherwise they looked like normal children from the neighborhood. The spokesman of the pair was the older boy who had a confident and calm demeanor that seemed unnatural for a child speaking to a stranger in a dark parking lot. The younger boy stood slightly behind him with a nervous energy and kept his head down, avoiding direct eye contact with the journalist. The older boy spoke to Brian Bethel with a smooth and hypnotic tone that sent a chill down his spine. He told Brian that they had come to see a movie, specifically the film Mortal Kombat, but they had realized they left their money at their house. The boy asked Brian for a ride to their house to retrieve the cash and promised it would not take long. The request was delivered with a strange level of eloquence and command that did not match the age of the speaker. Brian felt an inexplicable urge to open the door and comply. Despite the reasonable nature of the request, Brian Bethel felt an intense fight or flight response triggered in his nervous system. He described the sensation as a soul-deep dread that made no logical sense based on the visual evidence of two helpless children. His hand moved toward the door lock, but his mind was screaming at him to stop. The older boy seemed to sense this hesitation, and his tone became slightly more demanding and insistent. He assured Brian that they were just two little kids, and they did not have a gun. The specific mention of a weapon was a red flag that pierced through the hypnotic fog clouding Brian Bethel's mind. Why would a child feel the need to reassure a stranger that they were unarmed, unless they were trying to mask a threat? Brian looked closer at the boys and finally broke the spell when he made direct eye contact with the spokesman. The ambient light from the movie theater marquee illuminated the face of the boy and revealed the terrifying truth that would haunt Brian for decades. The eyes of both children were completely coal black, with no definition between the pupil and the white part of the eye. They looked like vast pools of darkness that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. The realization hit Brian like a physical blow, and he gasped in horror while recoiling away from the window. The mask of innocence had slipped, and the entity outside the car realized that the deception had failed. The demeanor of the children shifted instantly from persuasive to aggressive. Brian Bethel slammed his car into reverse, and the boys began to shout at him with anger and frustration. They yelled that they could not come in unless they were invited. This specific detail would become a cornerstone of the mythology linking these entities to ancient vampire folklore, which requires permission to enter a dwelling. Brian sped out of the parking lot and looked back in his rearview mirror. In the few seconds it took to exit the lot, the children had vanished completely into the night. Shaken to his core, Brian Bethel eventually shared his terrifying account on an internet mailing list later that year. This was the digital birth of the black-eyed children legend. His story resonated with thousands of people who claimed to have had similar experiences with strange children inducing irrational fear. The story spread from mailing lists to forums and eventually became one of the most famous pieces of creepypasta on the World Wide Web. But unlike pure fiction, many investigators believe there is a core of truth. We must analyze the specific elements of the Brian Bethel account to understand why it strikes such a deep chord in the human psyche. The setting of a parking lot at night is a transitional space where people often feel vulnerable. The antagonists are children, who are universally symbols of innocence and safety. By corrupting the image of a child, the story violates a fundamental social contract. We are programmed to protect the young, so fearing them creates a cognitive dissonance that is deeply disturbing. Following the 1996 reports of black-eyed children began to surface across the United States and the United Kingdom. A recurring theme in these sightings is the electronic malfunction that often accompanies the arrival of the children. Witnesses report that streetlights flicker or go out, and cell phones lose their signal. Garage door openers fail to function, and static interrupts radio broadcasts. This suggests that if these entities exist, they carry an electromagnetic field that disrupts human technology. Another chilling case involves a woman alone in her home in rural Ohio who heard a persistent knocking at her back door in the middle of a snowstorm. When she pulled back the curtain, she saw a boy and a girl standing in the deep snow wearing thin summer clothing. They did not shiver or show any signs of being cold despite the freezing temperatures. They simply stared at her and asked to come inside to use the bathroom. The woman noted that their footprints in the snow stopped abruptly, as if they had dropped from the sky. The woman in Ohio refused to open the door and locked all the deadbolts in her house. She reported that the knocking continued for over an hour, moving from the back door to the front door, and then to the windows. The children never raised their voices, but their request to enter became a mantra that she could hear even when she covered her ears. The next morning, she found muddy handprints on the windows at heights that were impossible for a child to reach without a ladder. Skeptics argue that the black-eyed children phenomenon is a classic example of pareidolia and mass hysteria fueled by the internet. Pareidolia is the psychological tendency for humans to interpret vague stimuli as familiar patterns often faces. In low light conditions, pupils dilate to capture more light, making eyes appear much darker and larger than normal. A child standing in a shadow with dilated pupils could easily be mistaken for having solid black eyes by a terrified observer. Furthermore, the timeline of sightings correlates perfectly with the rise of internet culture. Before 1996, there were virtually no records of black-eyed children in folklore archives. This suggests that Brian Bethel created a compelling narrative that others subconsciously adopted. When people experience fear in the dark, their brains search for a template to explain the threat. After reading the story, the image of the black-eyed child became a convenient template for that fear. However, folklorists point out that while the specific name black-eyed children is modern, the concept is ancient. In Celtic mythology, there are stories of changelings, which are fairy entities that replace human children. These beings often looked slightly wrong to the parents and had eyes that revealed their inhuman nature. The feeling of dread and the sense that the child is an imposter are identical to the modern reports. The legend may simply be a digital evolution of an ancient fear. The insistence on being invited inside is another direct link to historical mythology. Vampire lore from Eastern Europe dictates that a vampire cannot enter a private home without a verbal invitation from the owner. This rule was strictly adhered to in the Brian Bethel account and subsequent sightings. This suggests that if these entities are not vampires, they operate under similar supernatural laws or constraints. They require the consent of the victim to initiate the next stage of the encounter. There is also a theory within the paranormal community that these entities are interdimensional beings or extraterrestrials using a screen memory. A screen memory is a false image projected into the mind of a witness to hide the true appearance of an alien entity. Since humans are less likely to attack a child, the entities project that image to get close to their targets. The black eyes are the only part of the disguise that fails to render correctly, revealing the void beneath. Medical explanations have also been proposed to explain the appearance of the eyes. Conditions such as mydriasis cause extreme pupil dilation, which can make the eye appear black. Aniridia is a rare genetic disorder where the iris is missing or incomplete, giving the eye a dark appearance. However, these conditions are rare and would not explain why two children with the same condition would be wandering together at night, or why they would induce such primal fear. The clothing described in the reports is another puzzle piece that investigators examine. Witnesses consistently describe the outfits as drab gray or beige tracksuits and hoodies that look brand new but out of style. It is as if the entities are wearing a costume of what they think a human child should look like based on outdated information. This mimics the uncanny valley effect, where a robot or animation looks almost human but slight imperfections create a feeling of revulsion. In 2014, the hysteria reached a new peak, with sightings reported in Cannock Chase, a forest area in England known for paranormal activity. Investigating these international cases reveals that the phenomenon had successfully crossed the Atlantic. The descriptions remained consistent with the American sightings, proving that the specific details of the legend had become a global standard. The consistency of the narrative is either proof of its validity or proof of the power of the internet. Psychologists suggest that the black-eyed children represent a modern manifestation of our fear of the younger generation. As society changes and the gap between generations widens, older adults may subconsciously view youth as alien or threatening. The soulless black eyes represent a lack of empathy or connection to traditional values. In this light, the monsters are a metaphor for the anxiety of a changing world, where the youth seem unrecognizable to their elders. Despite the logical theories, the visceral nature of the encounters leaves a lasting mark on witnesses. Many report suffering from nightmares and paranoia for months after the event. Some even claim to experience bad luck or minor health issues, which they attribute to the proximity of the entities. This suggests that the encounter is not just a visual hallucination, but a psychic attack that drains the energy of the victim. The phenomenon also taps into the biological imperative of altruism. Humans are social animals hardwired to help those in distress, especially children. These entities weaponize that compassion. The horror comes from the realization that your kindness is being used as a key to unlock your destruction. It forces the witness to reject their humanity in order to survive, which is a deeply traumatic psychological event. If you ever find yourself alone at night and hear a knock at the door, you must be vigilant. Listen to your intuition and that quiet voice of warning in your head. Do not open the door if you feel a sudden wave of irrational fear. Look for the signs of outdated clothing and monotonous speech patterns. And most importantly, never look directly into their eyes for too long, or you might see the void staring back. The truth behind the black-eyed children sightings may never be fully known or proven by science. Whether they are demons, aliens, interdimensional travelers, or simply a projection of our collective fears, they have secured their place in history. They serve as a reminder that there are still mysteries in the dark corners of our world that defy explanation. The line between urban legend and reality is thinner than we would like to believe. As we conclude this investigation, we are left with the chilling realization that safety is an illusion. The walls of our homes and the locks on our doors are only physical barriers. If these entities require an invitation, then the only thing protecting us is our own will. The next time you hear a knock in the middle of the night, remember the story of Brian Bethel. Keep the door locked and wait for the dawn.